Hey, Andrew Wolf here. In this video I'm going to talk about peptic ulcer disease, but before I get into talking about the pathophysiology, I want to talk about the physiology of the stomach, in particular the physiology of acid production, the regulation of acid production, and the physiology of the protective mucosal surface of the stomach. Okay, so let's just review some of the mucosal layer of the stomach. So now, if you remember, the mucosal layer is very irregular in the stomach. It's filled with these sort of gastric pits, and I'm going to kind of draw one of these up close. So here we have a big gastric pit, and actually they're very, very deep if you look at the histology, and you can find pictures on in images, Google Images, very easily, that show you the histology of the stomach, and they're very, very deep pits. Now, on the surface here, we have a columnar epithelium, and the columnar epithelium is interspersed with what are called foveolar cells. And the foveolar cells are actually very similar to the goblet cells in the intestines, and their major role, as you might expect, since they are similar to goblet cells, is to produce mucus that lines the stomach. Now, this mucus, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, has a few major components. Obviously, it has water in it, but it also has a lot of mucin, as is typical of mucus. But then it has a special ingredient that's unique to the stomach, and that is gastric surfactant. Now, if you remember, a surfactant is a molecule with that's very similar to, actually it has a phospholipid component, so it has a hydrophobic end and a hydrophilic end. And this provides a thin, impenetrable barrier that lies on top of the mucus and protects the mucus, that protects the cells from any charged molecules. In particular, the charged molecule that we're really worried about here is hydrogen, the hydrogen ion. So this provides impenetrable barrier protecting the mucosal cells. And again, those are called foveolar cells. And then, sort of moving down the neck into the gastric pit, we continue our columnar epithelium. And when we get sort of midway down, we have the parietal cells. And that I've seen them they kind of look like little cellular volcanoes. And these are parietal cells. Now, parietal cells pump out hydrogen ions. And I'm not going to get into the chemistry of just how they do that in this, but just be aware that their major role is to produce acid when stimulated, and we'll talk about how they're stimulated in a few minutes. Okay, so acid secretion. Okay, and one interesting cell here is called the ECL cell, and this ECL cell actually produces histamine. And it's actually stimulated by the parasympathetic nervous system, by acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nervous system, to release histamine, and then the histamine makes its way to the parietal cells to stimulate acid secretion. Now, 20 years ago or so, we thought that this was the major stimulus for acid secretion, and we invented a class of medications called histamine blockers. And it turned out that these work fairly well, but then we learned that that parietal cells are actually directly innervated by and respond to acetylcholine themselves. So that's why histamine blockers do reduce acid production, but they don't decrease it all the way. Now, if you give someone a PPI, on the other hand, a proton pump inhibitor, a proton pump is the mechanism by which the parietal cells produce their hydrogen ions and secrete acid. So if we give a proton pump inhibitor, it's a much more powerful drug at preventing acid secretion because it's not just dependent on one pathway. Now our columnar epithelium continues all the way down to the bottom, and then sort of at the bottom